In the first two videos we did about the cosmology, we were talking a lot about, let's call it the structure of the universe, what the fourth way calls the ray of creation, the architecture, the infrastructure of this universe, and how we fit into the whole. Because as Gurdjieff and Uspensky kept saying, you can't understand our existence here on this planet in this form, in isolated fashion. You have to understand it in relation to this much bigger picture. We're a small part of a much larger whole of something very big. And we talked about that structure, and these laws that we're going to speak about today, law of 3 and law of 7 as they are called, they are said to be the two fundamental laws of the entire universe. Everything in the universe, everything in creation is the result of these two laws and the interaction of these two laws. It's how the universe operates. So there's the engine, let's call it, of the universe, and then there are these laws that govern how it operates. The law of 3 says that every event or every phenomenon that exists only exists due to the fact that 3 forces have come together in combination in what's called a triad, and in a certain relationship to each other, that they take the form that they take, or the event is in such a condition as it is. Another way the fourth way states this is that everything in the universe is in motion. Everything is vibrating. These forces come together in combination in such a way, 3 forces making possible everything that we see inside us and outside of us. And then how these events or these forces or these phenomena progress through time and space, they do so according to the law of 7, which is called the law of octaves, because the musical octave, the scale of the musical octaves in the West, is said to have derived from this law and said to be an expression of this law. And so everything happens in a series of steps. Things come together and it's 3 forces. The triad forms, and then it keeps changing, and it moves in stages, in steps through an octave. During the course of each octave, there are intervals that are encountered. And there are 2 kinds of octaves, and some of octaves are what are called ascending octaves. It's like the musical scale rising higher. And some are descending octaves. They go lower on the scale. They go to a lower octave, then a lower octave, then a lower octave. There are intervals in each, and this is why nothing remains the same for long. Nothing continues always at the same. Everything's always changing because it hits an interval, and then at the interval, the note changes. It slows down. Whether it's ascending or descending, it slows down for a period of time. And if it doesn't receive a certain type of either mechanical input, a mechanical shock, or a conscious shock, without that, it will just keep deviating, descending, or even if it's going, an ascending octave cannot really go up on its own. We'll be talking about that. But I know you want to make this as practical as possible, and I appreciate that. At the same time, we want to communicate the fact that theoretically, these laws are governing everything outside us in the entire universe and everything inside of us. And so, for example, we can look at just our existence here on Earth, on the planet, this organic life on Earth that covers the surface of the planet. And it's said to be a result of the interaction of 3 forces, 3 influences, coming from the sun, coming from the moon, and coming from the planets. And the influence of these 3 interact. And this is what creates or produces or manifests as what we know as life on Earth in all its forms, mineral, vegetable, animal, and human kingdoms, all the result of the influence of these 3 forces in different combinations. For example, the idea is that this organic life on Earth, if you think of it as an organism on the surface of the Earth, it is essentially breathing. It's inhaling sunlight. The same way our body inhales breath, that's what photosynthesis is. It's organic life is, you could say it's inhaling light to sustain itself. This is what is called the active force in the 3 forces. There's an active force, a passive force, and a neutralizing force. First, second, and third force in fourth way terminology. Sun is this active force. The moon, it acts as a passive force or a denying force, and it's pulling on us. It's giving shape to form. And the third force, the neutralizing force in this, is influences from the planets. That's the theory. So everything takes shape according to the influence of the planets. The planets are very much influencing life on Earth in ways that are not normally understood. All of these different planets are giving all this color and all this shape and all this variety to this energy and this matter. Energy coming from the sun, the matter, so to say, being provided by the moon and from the Earth itself, the physical Earth itself, and then being given shape and color and variety and dynamics by the influence of the planets. And this organic life, by the way, as we talked about before, is like a stomach in the solar system. It's digesting this material in all this way. Material is formed on the Earth in the shape of organic life on Earth, and it gets digested, and when everything dies, it passes magnetic field material to the moon, and it nourishes the moon. That's the theory. The same thing happens inside us. We breathe air, we eat food, our stomach digests all this material, and it serves the sustenance of our human existence. There are three forces at work when we digest air and food and what the fourth way calls impressions. These reflections of light and the air from the planetary world, which is our atmosphere really, and then food, matter, from the Earth itself. These are three forces at work in us all the time. And these are serving the purposes of our physical existence in the same way that the organic life on Earth, as the stomach of the solar system, is serving the purposes of the sun and the moon and the planets. The idea is that the influences passing from the sun to the planets, including the Earth to the moon, in a descending octave, have reached an interval. And these influences cannot get to the moon to sustain the moon. They need some kind of interaction, a different kind of shock. And so organic life on Earth exists for that purpose. Now, the sun and the planets can influence the Earth in the way I just described earlier, in such a way as to create a material that can be digested in order to be further transmitted to the moon for the sake of sustaining and developing the moon, which is considered to be an embryonic planet. It's a complex theory. From one point of view, it's just science. What we want to realize is the same laws that are governing this mechanism in of the solar system at work, always in dynamic motion. Those same laws, those same principles are at work in us. Our body is like a ray of creation, or you could think of it almost like a solar system. And these same principles are at work. They affect our physiology and they affect our psyche. They don't just affect, they govern. They're responsible for our physiology and all of our digestive system and how our neurons fire and our psychology, the kind of thoughts we have, how we experience emotion. And we'll get into more particulars about that, how to see that in a practical way, a real way, a personal way. But this idea, we're under the same laws, exactly, but they operate on different scales in different ways. So they operate different on the human scale than they do on the planetary scale or on the galactic scale, but they're exactly the same. And the entire ray of creation, as articulated in the fourth way, is an octave. It's a descending octave. And the manifestation of it, the growth of the universe, is a descending octave. And it's a progression of 7 stages with intervals based on triads that keep moving, sort of rotating, changing position as they pass through this octave.
Yeah, and for people who are interested to get really precise about this, I highly recommend In Search of the Miraculous. Ouspensky goes in great depth with diagrams and
his book, The Fourth Way, also.
And speaking also, how the solar system is unfolding according to this law of 7, how the body as microcosmos, as a cosmos, the body from the intake of the 3 types of food, air we breathe, and the actual solid food and water we take, as well as through the 3rd subtle food of perceptions, impressions. There is a process happening, so that the whole digestion is aligned with the law of 7. The whole creation of the embryo is aligned, and the development of the body throughout the life is governed by the law of 7 and law of 3. The history of humanity, the developmental of societies, of political systems, as well as fashions. One can see how throughout the history of humanity is governed by the law of 7. Wars, development of art, religions, how the so-called religion as a civilizing, at best a civilizing influence on the masses. They actually start with the being and the wakefulness of a sage that brings a certain teaching which is designed to help people awaken. However, after maybe 20 years or 50 years after the sage dies, it becomes like a whole institution and a church, and after a few hundred years they are trying very hard to maintain the teaching, but inadvertently what happens in a few hundred years or a few thousand years, basically the teaching of Jesus ends up really distorted and diluted to the point that manifests as burning people at stake and ends up with the Spanish Inquisition and so on. All the political system, even capitalism, with the Declaration of Independence and freedom, comes from a relatively noble and wise perspective, but then it ends up in a very rotten and criminal way. And the same other ideas of freedom and equality ends up with Bolshevik, communist, Cold War.
And all of those are examples of descending octaves. They're proliferating, they're becoming more and more dense, taking on more and more form and more complexity. And as you say, in the process, becoming more and more distorted, deviating from their origin, not only from the form of their origin, but the purpose, the intent. You can see this for example, in yoga. Nowadays, yoga is considered a fashion. It can be a social gathering, just to go and kind of engage in what's called infrasex. Kind of, you get together and it's kind of, you get to share your body and look at some other bodies.
Glamorization, look at me,
yes.
We are also cool, and look at my yoga pants. And
yes, and then also it's about, now it's considered a health thing. It's good for reducing, as is meditation, same thing, for reducing stress, anxiety, bettering your health, things like this, whereas its origin had of a spiritual nature. It was about transmutation, transformation, regeneration, awakening, self-realization, the heightening of the consciousness of awareness through movement or through what is called meditation. Now these things have taken on a life of their own, particularly beginning back in the 20th century and continuing to this day to stray farther and farther from their original intent, their original purpose, and their highest potential, you could say. These are all descending octaves in humanity.
Maybe we can get in there now more precisely. So as we know it, this law of 7 is that these nodes, for something to grow and to continue in a conscious direction, one needs somehow to have the knowledge and the insight and the being to bridge those two intervals. The idea is that between the mi-fa, the two notes, there is a certain interval, like an impasse, where the octave loses energy, loses its momentum of keep going up, and there is a little like a lulling of the energy. And there is another such interval at the si-do, which is theoretically twice as big. And the idea is that if those intervals are not being bridged consciously, then that octave deviates or changes, loses its initial direction. It starts in a certain way and ends up losing its momentum or ending up in a completely opposite, contradictory way of what was.
Or it may gain its own mechanical momentum, and just that's where proliferation and expansion and growth can happen. Like we talked about before, we could start a business and soon it will have its own momentum. We wouldn't be even involved. Other people and other circumstances would be governing it, and it would be governed by the forces governing those things. But it would be all mechanical, automatic, unconscious. That's a descending octave. For it to be an ascending octave, which is what, by the way, enlightenment, awakening, self-realization is. This is an ascending octave of consciousness. Consciousness rising through the ray of creation as an ascending octave. This is why it is so powerful and so rare.
So in order to have such an ascending octave, and for anybody interested in awakening or reaching one's full potential from the point of view of consciousness, it's important that is required to have the knowledge and the being to bridge those intervals, to know about the fact that no matter how enthusiastic we were initially, and how many books we read, and how much full of fire of interest and noble-heartedness, that will wane, especially if we are just on our own, and after a few months or a year or two it just becomes a vague memory, or we are just doing like 10% of what I used to do. So in order to stay on track and keep ascending, we need to know about the existence of intervals, and to have enough knowledge and skill and a structure that help us to give our evolution the conscious shock in order to keep staying on track. And then as we reach the last interval, the C-Do, now that's necessary to give a double the amount of conscious shock to keep staying on track. And so that's really vital and practical knowledge for anybody on the path of awakening. And this reminds me that Gurdjieff was saying, within 3 generations, my teaching will be twisted up in knots. And now the fourth way has gone through various phases, and they're all kind of groups and organization of various degrees.
And there's even contention and disharmony and disagreement and isolation and all these mechanical forms of automatic descending octave with his teaching. Left to the logical mind, this is what happens. And then it becomes a subject of debate rather than a means for awakening. And you would think that people would want to get together and cooperate and facilitate and help one another in this process. But that also is rare because of the fact of this. The impetus in the universe is descending. The impetus as in our human lives, it's to fall into descending octaves. Ascending octaves require what the fourth way calls intellectual parts of sinners. When we hit these intervals, when we come to these intervals, we're trying to make something go up, and then it starts to slow down and we lose energy or interest, and we tend to then deviate from it. To continue on that line, that ascent, requires what the fourth way calls intellectual parts of sinners, which are very controlled attention that is very much connected to conscious awareness. Whereas a descending octave requires little or no attention, and things just happen, and things go on their own, and things deviate on their own, and little is done to interrupt that. This is why you see a lot of imitation, for example. Mihai, you mentioned fashion. Fashion is basically imitation. Somebody designed something, and then those were put in the store, and then you can't find the old style or whatever it was. Everybody starts wearing the same eyeglasses for a period of time, or the same shirts, the same shoes. It's all imitation. It's been like that throughout history. This idea that intervals come, and we have to have the understanding of what's going on, and we have to perceive it. We have to be aware we're encountering an interval. And then we have to think, not necessarily just think, but comprehend, what's the nature of this interval? Do I want this octave to continue? What's my intention? And do I make an effort aligned with that intention to keep things on course? And how do I do that? Or does it just carry on by itself, deviate, and then we follow it, we get dragged along down with it?
To make it a little bit more as applied to the human body mind as well as the human's conscious evolution, it is known in the fourth way that nature takes care of the development of the body from 2 cells into all this complex biocomputer, and somehow nature does this automatically, and it bridges all the intervals somehow by divine design, so we get to being an adult. Although I know that in terms of psychological, emotional, ego development, there are many things can go wrong, and certain stages of development as a child can be stunted, and the psychological, emotional development can remain far behind. However, the body still develops. And in the fourth way, the idea is that nature develops us without our participation up to the point where we are adult, and we are in the second state of consciousness. We are in the waking sleep, which is everybody on the planet. This is the default state as compared to other possible states of consciousness. However, we have potentiality for a lot of other potential of consciousness expansion. However, it needs our participation. And in order to do that, we need to find higher knowledge, we need to find support, we need to be willing to practice hard. The idea is that we need to bridge these intervals ourselves, the interval on our evolutionary path, in order to stay on track and make actual progress without fooling ourselves. The psychology and the bringing awareness and self-remembering, all of those are actually designed to keep the octave ascending and to stop a descending octave from tumbling down.
Let's think of it moment to moment. Moment to moment, our mechanical tendency, our automatic tendency as a human being psychologically is to lapse into imagination, to identify with what we're doing. Our consciousness attaches to what we're saying, what we're seeing, what we're doing, what somebody else is doing, to the weather. It attaches, we immediately associate a feeling of identity in relation to it. That's why it's called identification. We've attached our sense, invested our sense of an identity into it. So that's the mechanical tendency, moment to moment, descending octave. And it's a triad also. It's 3 things that are happening moment to moment that cause us to continue to be in this descending octave. Psychologically, we're just so easily prone to going into imagination, literally second to second, every few seconds at least, and to be identified. This so-called first conscious shock, to turn this around and now have this descending octave become an ascending octave, is what the fourth way calls self-remembering. Other teachings call it awareness, being present, just trying to become conscious of yourself and your surroundings. All of this is now turning this around, turning it up. And now our consciousness, instead of lapsing into a descending octave, literally falling down, is now trying to lift itself up. There's a lot of force against this, preventing this normally. And so we need to understand, why is it that when I try now to be present in my life, moment to moment, instead of in imagination and identified, why can't I do that? It doesn't just, you just don't decide to do that and then it happens. This consciousness has to sustain itself consciously. That doesn't mean effort in the way we normally think of effort, but it is a kind of an effort as far as how the mind thinks of it. But nevertheless, awareness now, our consciousness has to sustain itself moment to moment. And this is not easily done, and it's not happening with most people most of the time. But this is this first conscious shock fourth way talks about, and it is based on the principle of be aware of yourself in your surroundings. Know that you're being aware, conscious, just you in your surroundings, and knowing you're here, knowing you exist. This is rarer than you think in what's going on with most people in their heads. The second conscious shock refers to this idea of transforming negative emotions and transforming suffering, which is transcending them. Normally, when we encounter difficulties in our life, what the fourth way calls friction, pressure, resistance in our life or something we're trying to do, normally what happens is we rebuff those things. We push back, we resist, we become negative, we become irritated, we become angry, we feel sorry for ourselves. or we try to bull our way through it. We try to push our way through it. And both of these are mechanical, both of these are automatic, both of these are part of a descending octave. It's how we remain embroiled in these pressures of our life as a sense of identity. And the second conscious shock implies that awareness, by virtue of having bridged that first interval with the first conscious shock, self-remembering, awareness, consciousness, realizing, cognizing itself, can now sustain itself even farther, further, deeper, longer through pressure and through friction without becoming negative, not needing to rely on negativity as a protective device to absorb or go through difficulty or pressure, but to go through things consciously, to move through this interval consciously in such a way that the consciousness itself will be transformed. Consciousness itself will be heightened. It will expand, you could say, into even a higher dimension of itself by virtue of this so-called second conscious shock. The idea is shocks have to come from outside of the octave. They don't happen from inside of the octave. And when you think about it, consciousness is not in the mind. It's not in the body. So we're not trying to push, I'm going to get through this. No, it comes from outside, meaning it comes from a different dimension. It's coming from a conscious dimension as awareness is now influencing this octave in such a way that the octave will ascend, it will rise. The fourth way, this whole idea, law of seven, octaves, everything, it's so scientific, the terminology. And what we're talking about has to become intuitive, but you have to have the knowledge, you have to know about it well enough for it to go beyond your mind. You can't just think about this alone and have it happen. And you can't just feel it. You can't just want it to happen. There has to be something else. As Gurdjieff said when talking about the second conscious shock, he said, it's a special influence over your emotions, and particularly over your negative emotions. When we encounter problems, pressure, friction, we usually fortify ourselves against that with some kind of negativity. It can be passive negativity in the form of depression. It can be very active negativity in the form of anger and force and violence. That's normally how we meet it. This idea of a special influence over our emotions in the midst of friction, in the midst of suffering. He's referring to consciousness itself influencing our behavior and our thoughts and our emotions.
So first, we learn how to give ourselves the first conscious shock, the self-remembering, bringing, even reminding ourselves to be, to drop the daydreaming and to bring attention in the present moment and to be aware of thoughts, aware of feelings, aware of the world, and stay present as long as possible. This is working at the first conscious shock. That is necessary also in the octave of beginning of the work. The beginning of the work, the active force, the initializing force, as sometimes Gurdjieff call it, is the curiosity or desire for the truth and the sensing of something higher and being drawn towards that. There is this part of us, that's the initializing force. Then right away comes the denying force, opposing force, with all our inertia of all our lives spent in daydreaming and being identified, and all the traumas and all the mechanical attitudes and all our sleep, which is very strong force, is the denying force. So now I want to be more awake, and I am pushed back with all the mechanical habits. But then the third force, the reconciling force, or the third force, which makes the bridging the octave keep going further, will be to get to a school or to a group or to a teacher where you are taught you can't just want to be more conscious. You need to have the right knowledge, right skills, and to remember to engage this higher dimension of presence. Now we are going to stop being in circles, going into philosophies and theories. So there's some kind of conscious, we are going to pierce into beyond the mind. We have more frequent moments, longer moments of conscious being. So that will be the first conscious shock. However, many people who are working with us, they know that, it's actually, this is very hard, and 16 hours in the day, maybe you start with a few minutes of self-remembering. And then when somebody looks at me sideways, or somebody is negative towards me, or some friction happens, then all my work is down the drain. Basically, I react, I go into negative imagination, I express negative emotion, I am internally or externally, I'm churning into all the voices, and so that will be required the second conscious shock. But one can give the second conscious shock, one can transform suffering only if one has a strong, ongoing kind of self-remembering happening, because the second conscious shock is twice as hard. What is required is like, I'm present, and then somebody is negative towards me, or something bad happens, or something that stirs my psychology. The mechanical tendency is to get identified and lose it. And what is required is to become aware that there is this, like, I got hit, there's a shock in the system, which could go in a descending octave now, could go into I'm identified, or that shock, the moment you suffer, remember yourself. The moment you are negative, become more awake. And then I'm doubling my effort of be aware and notice of that, wow, there's this fire in my chest, and there is this strong tendency or energy building up that wants to lash out or wants to collapse. And now the second conscious shock is to bring this being aware, witnessing of this, and surfing the volatile energy and not letting it take over me, and being present with this negative energy, negative meaning unpleasant emotion, unpleasant stuff, and staying consistent with it. Now we'll transmute that energy into more presence. So that will be the second conscious shock.
You could say it all boils down to identification and non-identification, and that the first conscious shock, what is called self-remembering, is the first gear of non-identification. Not being identified with what you're doing each moment, and stepping back internally with an awareness, a presence of awareness, and not being attached, not being identified, not having identity, a sense of identity invested in what is going on. And the second conscious shock is the same thing, but it's like a different gear of non-identification. Now, non-identification has to be even more subtle, more non-identified, because there are degrees of identification and there are degrees of non-identification, and this second degree is a much more nuanced. It's one thing to separate psychologically from your thoughts when something's happening, as opposed to if something happens to your body and you're having physical pain or violence or threat, to not identify with that requires a different gear. But we can think of it as this quality of presence ascends by virtue of becoming less identified, and then less identified, and then even less identified, and continuing. Whereas, for example, negativity is the opposite. It's going in the other direction. It's because we become more and more and more identified. And we reach a point where we then, out it comes, either internally or externally. The expression, this negativity manifests either, as I said earlier, as a depression internally, let's say, as an extreme example, or violent anger externally, as an example. And there are many other degrees and variations of negativity. They are the result of us having become overly identified. Over a period of time, over the course of an octave, a descending octave in us psychologically. Whereas self-remembering, transformation, all of this means an ascending octave of consciousness, of awareness, becoming less and less identified with the body and mind, with the four centers, and more cognizant, conscious as itself. And we're going against great forces in the universe. Again, this goes back to these laws, these fundamental laws. The universe is designed to drive everything down in this way, to impel everything down. As Gurdjieff said, nature wants human beings to be as we are, identified, because we're this stomach. We're part of this stomach that's digesting and processing food in order to pass some kind of energy onto the moon. and even to reflect some of it back to the planets and even to the earth. And then consciousness is really awakening, enlightenment, and all that. It's really about this aspect of consciousness having been transformed in the human being, that in a way it is transmitted back toward the sun. It's going now up in this ray of creation. Now something's passing back up instead of all of it just descending down in this very mechanical octave driven by all these heavy forces. And so when we try to just, awareness tries to lift itself up, and that's really what's happening when we're trying to be present. It's as though awareness wasn't here, it was out of focus. Now it's trying to come into focus. It's trying to ascend, be. And that's what this idea to be is, to be present, for consciousness to be, and now sort of stand on its own legs. And then it wants to be able to walk and move even higher. Transformation is this further stabilizing and expansion of awareness, conscious awareness.
Since in the fourth way is very complex, has a lot of relativity, because from one angle it says what you said, that nature, it's in the interest of nature, of the mechanical universe, for humanity to be asleep. It serves a certain purpose. At the same time, there is the possibility, according to the fourth way, for some people to escape from this river, and Gurdjieff uses this metaphor of there's a river going downstream toward mechanicalness, automatism, lower and lower state of consciousness, inertia, going down to dying, asleep. So that's one river, and kind of almost all humanity is going that river that is going effortlessly downstream. Gurdjieff was saying that there is another river parallel to it going in the opposite direction, and actually people who have a mature magnetic center, this seeking part, and the idea is to somehow find a way to jump out as a fish, somehow jumping out of that river going nowhere and jumping into the other river going the opposite direction. We got to know about the law of 7 and law of 3 to bridge. We need to bridge these intervals with self-remembering and non-identification, transformation of suffering, going towards our full potential.
We rarely even recognize awareness. Awareness doesn't recognize itself as this awareness, this remarkable. When you start to see it, it is so amazing, the fact that we can be aware, and we can be aware of this awareness. This is unbelievable, but we don't ever think about it hardly. But when you start to see it, it becomes even more majestic and incredible. But then beyond that is, where does that come from? What does this awareness derive from? It has a source. It senses its direction home. It senses its direction into the present as presence, more and more and more, and against greater and greater odds and obstacles.
There's in the fourth way this idea, or Gurdjieff speaks about that. We say that man is created in God's image. At the same time, there's this idea that man, from one angle, the overall humanity, is like an acorn. And the acorn has within itself all the information and potentiality of becoming a majestic oak tree that is feeding the meadow and hosts and nourishes and shades, and but actually in nature very few acorns become oak trees. So this process of, it's not just discovering awareness, but it's a whole process of actually growing in these invisible realms. So we say, well, everybody has Buddha nature. Oh, the acorn have oak nature in it. But a lot of things need to happen for that acorn to become a sapling and to become a small tree and then to become a big. Even this octave of making skillful, consistent, sincere efforts towards awakening. That is hard. And the idea is that we can't, in the fourth way, that basically you can't do it by yourself. One needs a conscious influence, which can be in the form of a person that is much more conscious than us, or consciousness school, or a group, preparatory group, that is meant to serve evolution by helping bridge the intervals. That's why in the octave of awakening, or the existence of a conscious group or conscious school, it's meant to offer different lines of work. Work on oneself is one line, work with others and for others is another line, second line of work, and then there's a third line, helping the school, the aims of the group. Having all of these three lines at the same time help in a way to, when we reach an interval in our own inner work, we lost the enthusiasm, it's like a blah, now I go to a meeting, or I go to have a one-on-one with the instructor, and then I'm back on track. That's an important principle in the fourth way, that we need a group, or at least we need outside help.
Awareness doesn't transform accidentally. There has to be something, some kind of inspiration, some kind of light from above. There has to be some rich soil. And that rich soil, by the way, can also be a person's suffering in their life. That can comprise very rich, fertile soil for the awakening, the enlightenment, the realization of conscious awareness. And then knowledge, truth, some kind of intellectual framework to contain all of this in a way that's comprehensible to our mind while we're in human form. But these are the three forces. Again, this is the law of three at work. And really, that's what the idea of a school or a group is. It's this organization of three forces in such a way as to keep an octave ascending, the octave of awakening, of enlightenment, of realization ascending.
Basically, the school or the group or the teacher acts as a third force. So we have the desire of the seeker, the enthusiasm. Second one is the inertia of whole humanity being asleep, our parents being asleep, our whole society being asleep and mechanical, opposing. And if nothing happens, these are just hitting each other like, yeah, but I want to, I know there's something out there. And then falling back asleep, nothing happens. So the third force comes, higher knowledge with environment that is designed to raise our level of consciousness and with support.
It can be even more nuanced than that, because the three forces, you could think of yourself as the student or the disciple or the seeker in this environment, and then other fellow disciples, students, and so on, that create this soil as another element, and then the teacher or the influence of this conscious influence, these three forces. What can happen is, initially you come and it's right to be passive. As a person meeting a teacher, it's in right order, you are passive and you're absorbing knowledge, and knowledge is active. It's the active force. The student is the passive force. The teacher is the third force that's neutralizing these, harmonizing them, bringing them together successfully, healthily. Then this can change. There comes a point where the student needs to become active now in relation to the knowledge. So the knowledge, instead of acting on the student, they reverse positions. They reverse their role as an active and a passive force. Teacher would remain the third force. There may also come a time when it will shift again, and the teacher would assume the role assuming the role isn't right, but become almost the passive force. And the student working on the knowledge and having to understand how all these things fit together, and then the student, the disciple, the seeker becomes the third force, their own third force. It isn't one static triad all the time in a group. Just as in a marriage, in a relationship, it's not always a static thing. These forces are always moving. But how, as they move, and this is this idea of the passage of forces through an octave, it's always a triad, and the triad keeps shifting as this octave develops. This is where the Enneagram in the fourth way, the Enneagram is really intended to show in symbolic form the interaction between the law of three and the law of seven. They're never operating separately. they are really one thing. And the law of three and the law of seven explain different aspects of this one thing, and this whole involvement of this movement of forces. This is almost conscious science. This is science of another dimension, in another dimension of understanding. The fourth way presents it in a way that the mind can try to kind of get a handle on it intellectually, mentally, but then it begins to become much more intuitive, because you're seeing it more consciously.